Welcome to SST8's series on literacy. The intent of these webinars is for teacher-based teams, individual teachers, or building level teams to view and discuss this content and provide flexibility in meeting your professional development needs. For example, you may choose to chunk the content and break it up over multiple days, or you may wish to use it as part of a professional development day. In this webinar, we will focus on the importance of building background knowledge and vocabulary for all learners. To support your learning during this session, you will want to access our Building Background Knowledge and Vocabulary resource document to use throughout the training. Thank you for joining us. Now let's get to it.
Before we begin, take a moment to complete the anticipation guide, which can be found on your resource document. Complete the Before section and then answer the 2 questions regarding background knowledge and vocabulary. Pause the video and resume when you are done. We have 3 main learning targets for this webinar. Participants will gain a foundational understanding of the science of reading, understand why building background knowledge and vocabulary is important for all learners, and know the value background knowledge and vocabulary adds to instruction. Did you know that Ohio has a plan to raise literacy achievement? The full document, Ohio's Plan to Raise Literacy Achievement, can be found on the Ohio Department of Education's website. This document was first released in 2018 and revised in January of 2020. Within this document, you will find Ohio's literacy vision. Ohio's vision is for all learners to acquire the knowledge and skills to become proficient readers. The Ohio Department of Education and its partners view language and literacy acquisition and achievement as foundational knowledge that supports student success, which is part of Ohio's strategic plan, Each Child, Our Future. To increase learners' language and literacy achievement, the department is urging districts and schools to use evidence-based systems and high-quality instruction, select high-quality instructional materials, and employ culturally responsive practices. During today's webinar, we are going to focus mainly on high-quality instruction. Ohio's language and literacy vision strives to reduce language and literacy barriers for each learner. Further, it aims to significantly increase the number of learners who develop the language and literacy skills they need for grade-level reading comprehension, and thus are prepared for their futures. Children need to develop proficiency in language and literacy for success in all the academic subjects, experiences, and opportunities they will encounter after finishing formal schooling. Underdeveloped literacy skills leads to underachievement in academic subjects and often affects school and social behavior. The first commitment included in Ohio's literacy vision is the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading applies across all ages and stages of language and literacy learning, from birth to preschool through elementary, middle, and high school. Goff and Tunberg describe that reading includes the critical components of word-level reading, decoding, and the ability to understand spoken language comprehension. One without the other is not sufficient for reading comprehension. Think about what happens when you read a note, a sign, a book, a contract, or a ballot. You'll need to decode the written words into speech and understand that speech. Although the equation appears to be simple, it is actually very complex. Before moving on, let's take a moment to look a little deeper in the simple view of reading. This will provide some background knowledge for those who are less familiar with the science of reading. The simple view of reading is an equation based on multiplication. For a student to be able to comprehend what they are reading, we need to think of two specific factors. The first being decoding, or the student's ability to apply sound-symbol relationships in order to read words. And the second factor is language comprehension, or a student's ability to understand spoken language, which includes vocabulary and background knowledge. If a student is unable to sound out words and doesn't understand what is being said, he or she will not be able to comprehend what is written. And just like multiplication, if either component is absent, which would be a factor of 0, then reading comprehension cannot occur. If we have a 1 in the decoding component and a 0 in the language component, meaning that the learner is a decoder or word caller, but there is no understanding of what the words mean, then reading comprehension is a 0. Conversely, if the learner has a 0 on the decoding word level side, but has a 1 on the language comprehension side, then reading comprehension will be a 0. Also, if a student has partial ability in decoding and partial ability in language comprehension, then reading comprehension, or the product, will be less than either of the factors. Proficient reading is a product of both strong decoding skills and strong language skills. Within each of these two major domains, decoding and language comprehension, there are additional specific skills that we can identify for the purposes of understanding how proficient reading develops. It is time to introduce another powerful graphic. Hollis Scarborough's reading rope is a powerful graphic that illustrates the strands that fluent reading comprises. Under each domain of the simple view of reading, word recognition and language comprehension are specific strands or subskills that are definable, measurable, and somewhat independent, but all the strands and subskills influence proficient reading. Let's dig deeper into the domains of the simple view of reading. First, word recognition has 3 subskills: phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. Phonological awareness is the understanding that the language is broken into sounds or phonemes. Decoding is the knowledge of the alphabetic principle in sound spelling correspondence. It is the ability to translate a word from print to speech. Sight recognition is the third subskill of the word recognition domain. Sight recognition is the ability to read words accurately with automaticity. Notice on the rope how the strands within word recognition are tightly woven. This is because these skills must be increasingly automatic, meaning if one is struggling to decode the words, one does not have the cognitive capacity to make meaning of the words. Proficient readers are reading by sight or recognizing the words because it is stored in their brain's letterbox. Now, let's shift to the language comprehension. The subskills of language comprehension consist of background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, syntax and semantics, verbal reasoning, metaphors and inference, and literacy knowledge, genres, print concepts. Remember, understanding the subskills under each domain helps teachers understand what must take place during instruction. Notice how the strands of the language comprehension subskills have the spiral effect. This is because these subskills are considered increasingly strategic. With all this in mind, we know that the simple view of reading is not so simple, and a skilled reader can decode print effortlessly, extract meaning, and make connections between new ideas within the text and existing knowledge. Background knowledge and vocabulary are interdependent and closely relate to each other. Background knowledge and vocabulary play an important role in weave their way into what it means to be a proficient reader. These two areas are the focus for the remainder of this webinar. There's one additional model to become familiar with before we dig deeper into background knowledge and vocabulary. The four-part processing model of word recognition is a wonderful model to explain the complexity of word decoding and comprehension. Follow along as I talk through how someone decodes a word and makes meaning. With this model, we start at the bottom and build up. The bottom part of the four-part processor is the word recognition part of the simple view reading. First, we start with the phonological processor. Phono, meaning sound, consists of the speech sound system, sound spoken and sounds heard. Next, we make a connection to the orthographic processor, ortho meaning print. Notice how phonics connects the phonological processor with the orthographic processor. This is when speech sounds connect to the letters or letter that represents that sound. As we move up the model, we are now connected to the language comprehension domain of the simple view of reading and the subskill of vocabulary. Before we move on to the meaning processor, let's brainstorm multiple meanings for bat. Take a moment and list or think about the meaning of the word bat. Bat definitions that may have come to mind are something you hold in your hand to swing at a ball, a mammal that flies in the night and eats mosquitoes, to hit something, to bat your eyes. Yes, we know multiple meanings of the word bat, but which definition are we referring to? Although this is a simple word, it can seem complex for one who does not have the depth of vocabulary. This may be true for many EL students. Although he or she may be able to decode the word, they may not know the meaning. We do not know which meaning of the word bat we should use until we read the word in context using our context processor. In the context processor, we are connecting to the language comprehension subskill of language structures. Listen to the sentence using the word bat. She told him she spent all her savings, but he didn't bat an eyelid. Because you have the vocabulary knowledge, you have the ability to determine which meaning of the word bat is needed to understand this sentence. What are you thinking now? You just spent some time learning about the complex science of reading. So now, how will you use knowledge about the simple view reading, Scarborough's rote, and the four-part processor as you move forward in supporting students in comprehension? At this time, pause the webinar, locate the Turn and Talk section on your resource document, respond to the prompt, and discuss your thoughts as a team. You may have a lot to talk about, or you may have some questions you want to investigate. When your team is ready to move on, resume the webinar.
Welcome back. I hope you had a great discussion and have a better understanding of some of the foundational knowledge involved in the science of reading models. Now, let's dig into background knowledge. We often hear that educators talk about students' perceived lack of background knowledge and the challenges this can pose while reading. Instead of saying, these students don't have the background knowledge, what if we asked ourselves these questions? What knowledge do my students already have that can be leveraged to aid in understanding this text? What background knowledge do students need to access this text? And how can I ensure all students have access to that knowledge? We need to keep in mind that all students have rich funds of knowledge. Sometimes these funds of knowledge are a match for the text the teacher has selected, while other times they will not support their access to the content selected. As educators, we need to consider our students. What is their fund of knowledge related to the texts we have chosen? How can we determine how to support or scaffold their access accordingly? And what will this support or scaffold look like for various groups of students based on their needs? If you and your team wish to pause to consider these questions, please do so now and resume when you are ready to move on. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? A focus on teaching skills limits knowledge and reading comprehension. Take a moment to consider your answer. What students know influences how easily they learn. The background knowledge that a teacher builds for the students and the knowledge that they already possess influence which details they find relevant. When students have more content knowledge before they read, their understanding is better during reading. That knowledge can also make a hard text easier. Thus, schema theory directs us to build knowledge before reading. So focusing on knowledge makes sense. Knowledge can improve higher level thinking skills and content learning, and enable inference generation and memory for details. Natalie Wexler, in her book, The Knowledge Gap, addresses the important role that background knowledge plays in comprehension. Let's take a look at an example. Take a moment to read the paragraph on the slide. How well did you understand what you read? Are you able to determine the main idea? You were probably able to read each word independently, but how well did you comprehend? If you have knowledge of the sport cricket, then this passage may have made sense to you. If not, you would employ a few strategies to support your understanding. Am I hearing anyone say, well, I'll just Google it? Does this help? No one disputes that prior knowledge is important to comprehension. But when students struggle with comprehension, we rarely focus on building knowledge as our primary intervention. Instead, we practice comprehension strategies, attempt to build stamina, or simply ask kids to practice more. When many things seem important, knowing how big the impact of each factor is helps us to choose an area to focus on. Consider your TBT or PLC conversations. How does your team make decisions on supporting students? And how will you know when to focus on background knowledge? What questions can you ask within your TBT to push your thinking on this topic? At this time, pause for a team conversation around what your team has done in the past and what you might begin to think about doing differently moving forward. Resume the webinar when you have finished your discussion. Okay, let's take a look at a study and consider the role prior knowledge plays in comprehension. The graphic on the slide is from the baseball study by Recht and Leslie in 1988. Notice the 4 categories of students in this study: high reading ability with high knowledge about baseball, low reading ability with a high knowledge about baseball, high reading ability and low knowledge about baseball, and then finally, low reading ability and low knowledge about baseball. And as a technical note, high reading ability was defined as 70th percentile or higher on a standardized test of reading, and low reading ability was defined as the 30th percentile or lower. And then high knowledge of baseball was defined as 70th percentile or higher on a test of baseball knowledge, and low baseball ability was defined as 30th percentile or lower. The students in these four groups read a passage about baseball and then took a test of their comprehension. At this time, let's use the Notice and Wonder protocol to answer the following questions. What do you notice when you look at the information on the screen? And what are you wondering about as you look at the graph? Pause the webinar, locate the Notice and Wonder section on your resource document, and take some time for reflection and discussion. Resume the video when your team is ready to continue. So what are you thinking now? Here's the key finding from this study. Knowledge of baseball played a huge role in the students' success on the assessment. Students with low reading ability and high knowledge performed almost equally as well as students with high reading ability and high knowledge. In addition, there's not a huge difference between the two high knowledge groups and the two low knowledge groups. When we think about prior knowledge, we need to remember that each of us have many levels of knowledge based on what has been taught previously, our interests, and our own personal and past experiences. We can help support access to rich texts for all students by ensuring students have foundational and background knowledge. The what of knowledge building is not defined by the standards. We need to make choices as educators about what knowledge we prioritize for instruction. This involves thinking about how we can connect to knowledge about current events, student identities or interests, the core curriculum, as well as across content areas. To summarize your thinking about background knowledge, locate the background knowledge box on your resource document and write down some key ideas that you want to remember about using background knowledge to improve student comprehension. Then pause the video and resume again when you are ready. In addition to background knowledge, to help support student comprehension, students also need a knowledge of word meanings.
Background knowledge's partner is vocabulary. How to define vocabulary? Vocabulary refers to students' knowledge of and memory for word meaning. Vocabulary knowledge is demonstrated through reading, writing, and also through oral language. This model represents receptive and expressive vocabulary. Receptive vocabulary is the storehouse of word meanings that we draw on to comprehend what is said to us or to interpret what we have read. The brain stores words previously heard but not necessarily understood. The brain has what is called a mental dictionary of word meanings, including synonyms and related mental concepts. Recall the four-part processor. Remember, there is a meaning processor and context processor. Think back to our example of the word bat. In our mental dictionary, multiple meanings of the word bat are stored there. We can understand the meaning of bat in many contexts and use it in our speaking and writing. This brings us to expressive vocabulary. Expressive vocabulary comprises of words we know well enough to use in speaking and writing. Deeper knowledge of a word is needed for this skill. Really owning a word suggests that you can use it in your speech and writing. It is in your expressive vocabulary. Keep in mind, most people have greater receptive vocabularies than expressive vocabularies. As we think about the vocabulary knowledge of our students, or even ourselves, we can place our knowledge on a continuum. Take a moment and look at the word knowledge continuum shown on the slide. While coming across a spoken or written word, your knowledge of the word falls within this continuum. Let's do a little activity. In a moment, I will present a word. Read it to yourself and think about how well do you know the word. I have no idea what the word is or means. I have heard the word. I recognize its meaning and context, or I own this word. This is a word you could decode, but not necessarily understand the meaning to the point where you use it in your everyday speaking and writing. The word is nefarious. This is an adjective meaning wicked or criminal. The nefarious bully would often steal lunch money and kick sand in children's faces. Developing solid word recognition skills is the first step in reading, because one cannot understand something they cannot decode. But once the code has been cracked, building vocabulary is a key component to reading comprehension. Please take a moment to read this passage. Do you understand this passage? If not, why not? It is impossible to comprehend text without knowing most of the individual word meanings and the concepts they embody. This is just an example of what it is like when your students are reading silently. One of the most well-established findings in educational research is that reading comprehension and vocabulary knowledge are highly correlated with one another, and that knowledge of individual word meanings accounts for as much as 50 to 60% of the variance in reading comprehension. 50 to 60% of reading comprehension depends on word meaning. How much of a role does vocabulary play in your daily lessons? Pause the webinar and stop to think about and discuss the statistic. This statistic implies that what is read cannot be understood without knowing most of the individual words' meanings. The reading route indicates mastery of many sub-skills and account for reading comprehension. Vocabulary is the most important single factor once a child has learned the alphabetic code. How do you introduce a new word that you are teaching in depth? How should new words be introduced? No, we will not dig deep into that today, but understand that following an effective routine for introducing targeted vocabulary to students is key. The teaching must be explicit. Explicit instruction is clear, unambiguous, methodical, and goal-oriented. Listed on your resource document are links to a Crayon model resource and an explicit instruction video. Feel free to reference these resources to enhance your vocabulary instruction. You may wish to pause the webinar now to discuss or look at these in more depth or at a later time.
As this webinar comes to a close, here's a great reminder from Natalie Wexler's The Knowledge Gap. The most important factor in determining whether readers can understand a text is how much relevant vocabulary or background knowledge we have. Let's revisit our anticipation guide from the beginning of this webinar. Where would you place your understanding of the 5 topics now? And moving forward, how often will you consider background knowledge and vocabulary when planning for instruction? Take a few moments now to complete the after section of the anticipation guide on your resource document. Pause the webinar and resume when you are ready to finish up this session.
Thank you for your time. For additional information and resources, please visit our website at www.ssta.org/literacy, or check out our literacy playlist on our State Supporting 8 YouTube channel.